as I was saying, the Rural Nebraska Healthcare Network decided in 2006 that there was a digital divide because we couldn't get our patients and their exams to a referral hospital at the same time. The patient could make it there in 2 hours, but the exams were such that they didn't make it there across our T1 lines for quite some time. So the patients would have to be retested at the new facility and undergo all those tests again, be exposed to more radiation, and the cost of health care then doubles. So we were brought to the table by a partner, Hemingford Telephone in Hemingford, Nebraska, and they were aware of a grant through the Federal Communication Commission for rural health care providers, and they helped us to write the application, and long story short, we got the funding, the federal funding. We were able to install a fiber network specific to healthcare. We partnered with a company called Zayo, who is a communication provider, and they helped us. They leased fibers from us so that we were then able to pay our 15% share of that project to the federal government. So healthcare now in western Nebraska has an almost 800-mile broadband network with 36 fibers dedicated to healthcare, and in the process, the communities have now a middle mile network that has 48 fibers dedicated to commercial use, and local providers then are leasing from Zayo and providing the last mile to customers. It's enabled healthcare to get better access and have the broadband connectivity, and then it's providing access to businesses and homes throughout the Panhandle as well.
Thank you. That's very, very impressive.
Yeah. In my mind, I guess there's several digital divides. I would say there's a digital divide between communities that have access to broadband and those that don't. And then there's even a divide between the people that have broadband and that know how to use it. And I think there's really those three different layers there. As a community, we got together a lot of business leaders to talk about this issue, and we went around the table and talked about what type of service we had. And you mentioned a T1 line, and it made me remember that conversation. Somebody really thought they had something really cutting edge, and the best around was a T1 line, which I think maxes out at about 1 megabyte download or whatever it is. Our office is in a bank, and we were paying a couple $1,000s a month to have like 25 meg up and down. Some of the larger businesses in town had good connectivity, but we were having to pay large dollars to have that connectivity. And then there was there was spotty stuff available throughout the community, but on a good day you could get maybe 30 meg service, but it was non-dedicated. It was through a copper wire, and most of the time after school, once kids got home and utilization went up, you were lucky to get maybe 6 or 12 for download speeds. So really, I think the digital divide question is twofold. How do you get the connectivity to the communities? And then once they have it, how do you teach them how to use it? And I'm just as guilty of that. For being relatively young, I think, maybe don't embrace the technology as much as I can. I get pretty excited about it once I understand it, and once I see how it makes my life better and easier and more convenient. But even myself adapting to utilizing the technology once it's available, I'm probably leaving some meat on the bone there. I could probably sharpen the knife there a little bit.
Yeah. Thank you. That's exactly right. The digital divide has usually two ugly faces, availability and adoption. And as Mr. Wyatt was referencing, many times you do have the availability, but you don't have the subscribership or the adoption part.
I'll concur with that. I think back in 2007 there was a commission put together that would study how technology would impact education across the state. We were especially concerned about students in smaller schools, smaller communities in rural Nebraska who didn't have access. And they didn't have access to more than just technology. They didn't have access to quality teachers in some areas. We couldn't recruit people to come out to them. They were moving to the larger metropolitan areas, And so our kids were losing. And so rural Nebraska really led this whole process in schools because there was a need. And so that falls into the adoption. Who's willing to do something different to get more for their kids? And over the last 20 years of this system that we have in place, and we've had, thank goodness for the work of the telecommunications, the providers across the state, we have a network in this state that at the time that it was adopted was $55 a meg for us. And today it's 70 cents a meg because of the way that we collaborated and worked together and got people to work together. Gene's sitting here, and we have one of the most robust networks in the state, right, or in the country right now, helping us educate our kids so that the kids in the rural areas of the state have the same access. What was more difficult, I think, than the access was how we had to sell it. Because when we were in a study committee, superintendent after superintendent came through the room saying our distance learning rooms are dark. We're dark, we're not using it. Whereas in the rural parts of the state, we were saying we need it, our kids need it. And so these rooms were lit up. Thanks to blended education, it now has grown beyond the distance learning room that was a static room to a more mobile learning environment. And so adoption of a more mobile learning environment, when we start looking at how are these kids learning in college, what do they need to be prepared to be able to go to school, so these blended environments that are on the college campus really started to drive us to say, how do we present this to our communities, and how are they going to be willing to accept this, because this is a different education system than what they grew up in. And so the whole adoption thing, trying to convince people that this is a competitive way for their kids to learn, not because it mirrors what they did, but because that's how they're going to learn when they leave us. And it's how the whole phrase of lifelong learners. Well, how are you going to learn if you're not enrolled in a class? It's just going to be experience, unless you have access to those environments where you can read and study and learn. And so both are equal. It's the cost, but through collaboration. And so I'd say in the state of Nebraska, the next phase of the digital divide may have something to do with adoption, may have something to do with acquisition, but it really falls on community leaders as to how you're going to put together a plan that models something what K-12s and higher ed did to build this huge network that at one point wasn't affordable, but now is a necessity for us.
Right.
Okay?
Thank you. Very, very insightful. In fact, research shows that the urban-rural digital divide, if you would offer rural communities the same connectivity level as an urban community, the about 13 percentage point gap would disappear, and 32% of that would disappear just because of connectivity. Yet when we throw in the socioeconomic characteristics that are really, really tied to adoption, that gap would disappear, and in addition, 58%. Mm-hmm. And so that the main findings of that report were that it's connectivity is important, of course, but equally important is adoption. It's really that, how do you sell it? How do you get people to use it? So now that we kind of agree that the digital divide is an issue, and that and how it's being tackled, I guess the million-dollar question surfaces, right? How can we get connectivity to that last mile, to those rural communities, rural facilities that don't have it? It's very expensive, and so what you hear, and it's valid on both ends, okay? On one end, you have folks that understand the need, they want it, yet they cannot have it at affordable prices. And then on the other end, of course, the carriers will say, well, you know what, the numbers are not there, it's just not feasible. So my question to you from your unique perspectives, which is fascinating because we have a hospital perspective, we've got a bank or business perspective, and then we've got the school's perspective. All of three are community anchor institutions that are really the glue of communities, especially rural communities. So my question now becomes, how can we get that last mile out there? And it's not an easy challenge, but yet here we are brainstorming. So Ladies first again?
Sure.
Sorry.
Well, it's quite a challenge, and the example I gave you of the Rural Nebraska Healthcare Network putting in the middle mile infrastructure for the Panhandle, it's really the local then communication providers who need to put in that last mile. I think it's partnering and giving folks the opportunity. Not being a communication provider, I don't have a lot of history of how to get that last mile out there to the people, but I do know in western Nebraska we have local providers who are doing that, and they're providing gig capacity to homes and to businesses. So there's got to be some type of economic model that is working at least in western Nebraska. The town of Bridgeport is almost 100% fiber to the home. So, there's something there that some of the providers are doing that's working.
Oh, sorry, we have a question from the audience.
It's not a question. I've worked in telecommunications for 43 years. And, right, you want to stand up? For 48 years, and 18 years of that was helping get broadband throughout Nebraska. And right now, there's 341 communities in Nebraska. And the 32 smaller telephone companies are clearly utilities. Most of them have put fiber to every home, every farm, every ranch. But it's the bigger telephone companies who are fighting to stay alive with competition, overall competition, and limited competition. And I think it's hard for them to get the money to put that last mile in. But you have to understand that the last mile is in Nebraska. Out of Gordon, Nebraska, the last mile for one rancher is 70 miles. How do you make the money?
Right. And it is a complicated situation, obviously. I mean, both sides have a valid point there.
Yeah, it is interesting. Our town's that's less than 4,000 people in Gothenburg, and we have CenturyLink was our last mile provider, is our last mile provider, and I think a lot of the infrastructure subsidies that would have come back to CenturyLink, ours ended up in Minneapolis instead of in our zip code. Those dollars got reinvested elsewhere, and so it was really frustrating for me. I'm not a real techno guy, but I was visiting my sister in Seattle. This has probably been 8 years ago. Back then, had the big laptop, and I was doing some work from Seattle, and all of a sudden it was like something happened to my laptop when I was on the airplane. All of a sudden it worked faster. I could do work from Seattle infinitely quicker than I could do it from my office at home, and I had no idea why that was even happening. Got home and my computer worked slow again, and so I got our technology people, and they said, well, it was probably because your internet connection was faster. And I said, well, I want that here because I can work 10 times faster and be a lot more efficient out there working from a couple thousand miles away. So we started on this initiative to how are we going to get that type of speed available in our community. And it was really, really frustrating to me. I live on the edge of town in Gothenburg, and fiber providers trenched in fiber to go all the way across the state of Nebraska went less than 100 feet from my house and kept on going. They went right past our community, and we tried to get them, hey, let's branch some of that off right here. Yeah, can't you put some of that into our office or into our house? And there just wasn't that interest. In our community, there's 1,200 households, and so we started a survey of our homeowners and tried to solicit last mile providers to come to our community, and nobody was interested just because it's pretty cost prohibitive, pretty expensive to put a network into a community without knowing whether or not you're going to have that adoption rate to pay for the network. So I understand the business model. I'm a businessman myself. So what we did was build a business case that they really couldn't say no to. We did, of the 1,200 surveys that we issued, we got, I think, about 800 of them back, so 2/3 of them back. We had professionals in our community literally going around door to door, helping people fill out their surveys and getting those surveys returned. The survey results indicated that we did have a need in our community, and we had to educate a lot of people because I didn't know about broadband. I didn't know what it would be like to work on a fast connection. I didn't know what it'd be like to be able to download a movie in 10 seconds and be able to fast forward it and rewind it without it buffering, or look at Facebook and not have the spinning circle of death sitting there waiting, or even check the weather. We didn't know what we were missing out on. I gave the analogy of my parents growing up, lived in an older home, but we had a garage, which was nice. Some people didn't have garages, but we didn't have a garage door opener. So I grew up, somebody would open the garage, they'd back the car out, you'd close the garage, and you didn't think anything of it. And then we bought a house and it had a garage door opener. I thought, oh, my poor parents that are still getting in and out of the car and opening and closing that garage door every day, and the garage doors are like $150. It wouldn't have been much to put one in. But it's just insane. After you've done something for a while, you just get used to it. And that's the reality that you have. And from an outsider's point of view, they might see it, but when you're doing it every day, you don't really realize how insane it is. And I think that's the struggle with broadband. Most people, unless they've had that experience somewhere else and see how enriching it can be to your life, it's tough to get your arms wrapped around. I know unless I would have had that experience with my laptop, I'd have probably been the last guy to get on board with the project, and here I end up being an integral part of it because I saw how it can make a difference to me and my family. And we've got 4 kids, and how it makes the world a lot smaller place. We live in a town of less than 4,000 people, but we don't take second seat to anybody as far as what we can offer our kids, and a lot of that has to do with connectivity. So it's critically important, but it's educating people on how it can make their lives better and what those opportunities look like. And then it's really finding a partner. I think that was the question. I kind of a long-winded way to answer the question, but we had to engage a partner to invest literally millions of dollars in our community. So we did the survey, found out that we could get enough people signed up, we thought, and then the provider said, okay, if you can get 500 people to sign up, agree to take our service and pay a deposit, we'll come. So we went to work again. A huge committee of people, everybody from the superintendent, the CEO of the hospital, major manufacturings, the big decision makers in town got together and literally went door to door and had people signing up, paying a deposit to agree to this new service that was going to be coming to town. So we had to get to 500 before they would commit to putting the service into town, and it's been kind of a neat project to do, but it doesn't just happen. You don't just make a phone call and say, hey, we'd like service in town. It took hours and hours and hours, thousands of hours of work and volunteerism on the community's behalf to make it work.
Nate, I think that you're right. And I think in a nutshell for me, it's a paradigm shift. The last mile in Omaha looks a whole lot different than the last mile in Alliance. But it's just as important. I was in a meeting yesterday morning with the advisory council to the NITC, and we talked about last mile. And on the college campuses, kids had to pay for a connection. And I said, do you provide free connection in your dorms? And they said, well, yeah. I said, why? And I said, when did it turn from being a want to a need? And they said, well, we went to blended education and our classes are online, and we know that our college kids get online from 6 o'clock till midnight, and we needed to provide an environment that our kids could be successful in. And I asked University of Nebraska, when did you do it? Want or need? It's a huge investment for you. And they said, when it became a need. And I said, okay, so our last mile, it looks different than your last mile. However, the need for an education across the state, from a superintendent's perspective, is this. Our kids have a right to an education, and they have a right to an equitable education. It doesn't have to be the same, but it has to be equitable. And so I said, at what point is it no longer a want to the rural communities? At what point does it start to become a need? In some ways, we've done our K-12 students a huge disservice by turning our computers on, because contextual learning is what we do in school. Kids go to a place and they learn. And we know that when you leave that environment, that you also lose memory of it. And within 24 hours, you'll lose 80% of what you learned yesterday. So the need for homework in grades 3 through 12 is so that we can sustain what was learned today, generalized and practiced in a different environment, and then they come back and they fix what they don't know. Well, today we put our textbooks on computers. And so what we've done is we've basically told them, oop, textbooks don't go home for those of you kids who don't have access at home. And so while digital education may have created a more inviting atmosphere in school for kids to learn, if it's not extended for those kids, they're at a huge disadvantage. When we started in this process about a dozen years ago, we built a school community library onto one of my schools so we could extend the learning day. And we spent the money because there was a need. We had no place for our kids to get access. And then each one of the little schools that I worked in, we had to find some way for our kids to get access. I went to Alliance, and they had about 80% saturation in town. But I had kids who lived 60 miles out in the country, and they drove 60 miles one way, but many of them stayed in town during the week, but they go home on the weekends. Well, they had no access at home. And so their right to a fair and equitable education became a need for us to address. Not a want, but a need. When you start looking at this thing, we've accepted that living in the rural parts of Nebraska can cost us more, because education for a kid who lives out in a small class D2, class D1 school, they don't consolidate because they're already 50 miles apart. But the cost of those schools is between $25,000 and $30,000 per student. The lowest cost in this state is $7,000. Until we start to understand, like we did with Network Nebraska, that access is like an insurance policy. The healthy people pay for the sick people. Our premiums aren't based, because if the only people who paid a premium were sick people, then we'd have huge costs for people who are not well. But access to broadband is a shared commitment from the state. And until we change that thinking, that way of thinking, that, by God, I'm just paying for what I want. Because we were just talking that diploma in the state of Nebraska, the cheapest diploma that a high school kid walks away from is an investment from the community of $140,000 each diploma. And in the places where the cost goes up per pupil, it's over $250,000 is what that diploma costs, but that's a right to that kid. And so what I'm saying is we have to look at our models for how we're providing education across the state. We've got to look at the models at how we're providing access to those educators who are talented and who are living in a place where they can still deliver, whether I choose to live in Schuyler or in Gothenburg or Kearney or Omaha, that I have access to that quality education. But we have to create a model, much like we've done in so many other sectors, where healthy people pay for sick. Okay? When your kids graduated from school, you didn't pay for their education, but you will pay for it because during the 12 years that your child went through school, your taxes may have paid a portion of your child's education. So the commitment for us is this, is how do we create that model for the last mile that makes it an affordable product for us, where we accept that we're gonna pay a fee to educate those kids, and that fee includes that last mile expense.
Thank you. Very, very insightful. And I know it's a complicated situation. Like I said, you face it. I face it a lot down south, and I hear it's here somewhat of an issue as well. But just like Mr. Hayden was saying now, it's really a change in mentality. It's a change of a want to a need. And believe me, folks, I have no doubt that this same conversation took place 100 years ago with electricity. Okay? So let's not reinvent the wheel. Okay? I think that the possibilities are there. The resources are there. It's just a matter of how we can collaborate, because all these three examples, nobody did it alone. Nobody. It's a matter of collaborating. The problem is, if I reach out to him, but he feels it's a want and I feel it's a need, then we're going to have some collaboration problems, right? So again, I think that I do believe that internet is the 21st century infrastructure. It really is. And because the digital age moves so quickly, if you play defense, you're not going to catch up. You're just not going to catch up. So thank you so much for that response. Again, it's the $1 million question. There's no easy answer. That's why we're here today. But I totally agree. We've got a great example, two great examples, and it's all about a mentality, a mindset change. Who starts it, and who makes sure that we continuously educate and aware people? Now that's a different question. So fantastic. Going back to your unique positions, the themes I'm capturing here is that education can drive adoption, will drive adoption. That likewise with health, right? Because of all the issues you mentioned. I guess the next question would be, how can we, let me rephrase this. I think that it is a complicated situation, so what can we do moving forward? Based on the feedback we've gotten from each three of you, we know where we are right now. Where would you picture, or where would you want to be 5 years from now regarding the digital divide?
Well, with the basis of what Mr. Hazing just said, broadband should probably perhaps be a utility model. If I think about how the Rural Nebraska Healthcare Network applied broadband to the hospitals, it is a utility. A physician moves into an office, he has electricity, he has telephone, he has broadband. I mean, it's there. So he doesn't have to go out and source that for himself. So using that model and the fact that people have a right and need the service, perhaps it should be some type of utility as opposed to the private sector provider business model. So we could work towards something like that with the infrastructure that's already there.
Right. That middle mile especially. Your thoughts?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and one I'm not sure I know the answer to, but when we think about how rapidly this is changing, I just look at the amount of broadband that our household or our office is consuming today and think what that'll likely be 5 years from now or 10 years from now. It does become more like a utility or something that we're absolutely going to have, definitely critical to the success of a community. But I don't know what the answer is. It's tough. As a business person, I understand businesses having a business model, but I also serve on the school board and very involved in our community. I understand basic services that we have to provide that the government plays a role in too. One of the things that I can't remember, I don't know what the minimum service requirements are that companies are held to, but I think they're fairly low right now. I think if they were held to those minimum service agreements, whatever the language is, but in concept that they have to provide at least a minimum of X, and that be ramped up from where it's at today, I think that would certainly help and get some of those last miles more broadband than what they have today. But it's really a 10-year question or a 100-year question, and we're just now starting to consume the data that we're certainly going to be consuming. And I think a lot of times I probably inaccurately think of that as being social or recreational. There's absolutely a business case, a healthcare, fire and safety business case for why that broadband is critical to the functioning of communities. And even some study I read said that some third world countries that are starting from ground zero have better technology infrastructure than what we have, because as they're starting to become developed, they're putting in modern infrastructure. We've got an outdated copper infrastructure that third world countries are trumping what we have, and to me that's frustrating. That's not right, but I don't know what the answer is.
Thank you.
I think the first step is what you're just seeing today.
Right.
When we got together with a study committee, Roger was in the room, and he was scratching his head the same way he's scratching his head here because he heard the issues that we have, and he had ideas for how he could help us put it together. We went to telecommunications, and Gene sits out here, but he was one of the pushers for us to say that how is this going to happen and how we're going to afford this thing. And so first of all, knowing the question to ask is the first step. Bringing it to a critical point of this is important. It isn't just a want, but it is a need, and how do we expand this? I guess my question to you is this. When you moved your parents, or maybe some of us, into a nursing home, you brought stuff from home, right? Because if you didn't, within a short period of time, their memory is gone. It's the most cruel thing that you can do to an elderly person is remove everything that is contextual to them because they will lose their memory in a short period of time. Our kids who leave my school go home to speak Spanish at night. They don't speak English. And so there is no school that extends beyond 4 o'clock. And so the worst thing that we do is sending our kids home at night. But the best thing that we do is we send them home to a family who wants them, okay? Because we don't want them at night. We want them in the day. But sending them home so that they can extend their learning. And when you look at your children who go home, kids who do homework at night will do better than kids who don't. We know that. And when we went to an environment that included digital learning, and while it's inviting and good for the kids to be engaged during the day, to shut it off at night for them, they resort to games. So we put iPads in all of our kids' hands, and we're 95% Latino. And we put it in their hands only to go home and have the parents fight with their kids because they're gaming at night. Because there's no internet access, but they can game. And they can play, and they're fighting. And so we created a paradigm that these parents are saying, this is crap. Is this what my kids are doing in school? They're playing games on the computer all day. So because of not having internet access, they don't get to see what their kids do. They just know the fight. And so in many of the cases, the kids who bring their technology to school in your communities and in my communities, outside of school, how are we engaging them so that they want to be involved in activities that will take them somewhere instead of some endless, silly game that just wastes time for them? It's partly our fault. We didn't create the environment for them out there. And so the paradigm has already started between us and the parents saying, is this really a want or is this a game? Or is this a need? And we've not convinced our communities that it's a need. And it wasn't until we went to the Public Service Commission, we went to the telcos, and we said, giving us access to every school system in the state, that's our problem. How are you going to help us? We didn't have an answer. We had a question, and we posed it, and we stayed with it. I think this is another question on the digital divide. How do we stay with it? How do we cause those people who have the ability to help us, legislators, Nebraska Technology Commission, I don't care where we have to go, but we have to keep pushing that message that our kids are worth it. They're a great investment for us. We're already spending the money, and how do we get them back here? And how do we get them to help us grow Nebraska? Because for most of us old white hairs, we're just about done growing Nebraska, and we got to give it to a better generation that can take us farther than we could.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Moderator can ask you to leave anytime.
No. Of course not.
I'm so passionate about telecommunications, I didn't retire until I was 70 years old. The Gene Mayor is broadband by the Federal Communications Commission, yet on universal service.
Now, I guess I wanted to speak up to that piece. The problem we have at the federal level, we don't have this policy to build out broadband. The Universal Service Program is still voice-based. The FCC is doing all kinds of things to move in that direction. But, you know, the problem is like, what, $60 billion to change this from, financially, the federal government's not in a position to just do it overnight. And then, by the way, we have this 96 Telecom Act that said, by the way, we want this environment to be competitive driven. You go to rural markets, that's not very practical. So we're trying to adjust policy. The FCC has done some things. Another piece of this, to mention something that Dan's interested in, the Lifeline program. Right now, the Lifeline program provides subsidies for voice connections. They're exploring they really need to hear from consumers that, push them along that path. And we're doing a number of things, but got a ways to go. I think we're headed in the right direction, but until that support system changes. Now, to brag a little bit about the commission has done several things with our own state funds. We have a state universal service fund for several years. We've promoted broadband. We started helping build wireless towers to push broadband. Now we have a grant program. I think the future of the ILAC support, where they previously got support for a telecom network, now at least half of that has to be dedicated to broadband construction. So there are piece parts to this. It is happening. It's a slow boat right now. If we get that federal policy change, I think you'll see quite a bit. The CAF 2 funding is another example. I have a map in my car that I would use tomorrow, but it shows where, the CAF 2 is a Connect America fund. It's one of the efforts the FCC is going to help price cap companies in Nebraska, that's CenturyLink, Windstream, and Frontier, multi-state companies, I'd say catch up to what the independent environment's done. We're doing broadband. They're providing some funding to census blocks that are high cost, not in the city limits of Lincoln, but outside for Windstream and others, but not the most high cost census blocks, which are going to go through an auction program. But it's a lot of money. For Nebraska, I think in total it's about $25 million a year over 6 years, so $150 million roughly over this 6-year period they've got to build up some rural broadband. And from my perspective, you're missing the boat if you talk about rural Nebraska. It's the city limits aren't that hard to serve. Densities are good. It's the rural piece. When you say last mile, you want to talk about the loops that are outside your city limits, because those are the ones that are most high cost, going to be the most challenging to serve. And if you don't dissect it a little bit, you're mixing apples and oranges, I think. And
Okay.
that's where those 50, 60 mile loops.
Wait, hold on. She raised her hand. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
As a legislator, I don't want you to kick the can down here. As many of you know, and I'm
She's the
looking
problem.
at you,
No,
I've
I'm just
had
kidding.
conversations and continue to have conversations with the Public Service Commission, with service providers, with the NITC. It's not the garage door opener. This is not convenient. This is necessity. This is definitely infrastructure and communication, economic development, participation in a global economy. This must
Go ahead. 2 minutes, please, because we've got to wrap up.
Sure. In Nebraska, when it comes to in town, for most towns today, they're a 10 gig node or a 40 gig node or a 100 gig node on networks all over the state of Nebraska. So when it comes to town, that's the easy part. It's the outside of town that's the hard part. And the dead zones she was talking about are the areas outside of town where you might have two different companies, service areas that might meet up at an edge, or it's the far outside edge of their service, facility, and not all those communities are built out to. Now, CAF2 has build out requirements in it from the FCC for broadband, and those CAF2 build out requirements will work great in areas where customers are in rural setting that has less than $320 a month in cost to serve. If you get over $320 a month in cost, then FCC decided that's called a rural high cost or rural area that is of excessive cost. And at that point in time, there'll be a different set of funding dollars from the FCC that could work there, plus probably some providers who will bid to make that service built. For rate of return carriers, there's also an FCC process going on that'll have build-out requirements. Rate of return carriers are the small telephone companies, like there are about 30 of them in Nebraska. And so you'll have to build out your rural areas outside of town, up to the point where you hit this $320 a month cost support mechanism, which at that point in time, there could be bids also. All of this stuff is still in the FCC's hands and very much up in the air. And as a provider of those kind of services, I'm waiting right now to invest dollars in certain areas because of what's going to happen with the FCC. Now, the only way we'll know is for them to put out an order and go through that process. But in Nebraska, every single high school, minus one or two, and they are parochial schools in metro areas, has distance learning. They have it at 100 megabits or higher, at least 100 megabits. Okay?
Fiber, dude.
And all 99% of those schools are touched with fiber. Gothenburg actually has this nice fiber network that's rolling around, built by Pinpoint, but it's interconnected to the Nebraska Link network that goes all around the state and has nodes all over the state at 10 gig, 40 gig, 100 gig, and higher. And that Nebraska Link network also supplies Network Nebraska services. So it's, I don't want you to, Nebraska is actually one of the very best states in the whole United States for connectivity, by far and away. People sitting here and bash the broadband in Nebraska, it's so much better than most of the places that you would go, it'd blow your mind. But you have to understand that we're spending 40 to 60 to 70 million a year building rural service to our farthest out customers as a group. And we can only go so fast. I mean, we can't even find contractors to build all the stuff we need to build. So we're working on it.
Okay. Thank you so much for that information. One last question. Yes.
So a number of the panelists have already spoken to this a little bit, and I'm really interested in the education piece that you've been talking about, the community education piece. My husband and I moved from Washington, D.C. to a rural Iowa community of 700 people 4 years ago, and the deciding factor was which of the communities had fiber. And now my husband will travel back to D.C. and complain about how slow the internet is and
Right.
And we've talked to some of our elected and appointed officials, some of our friends, colleagues, peers elsewhere in the region, and some people get it and some people don't. And I just don't know if you could talk about some strategies for this education that you're talking about.
Go ahead.
We've got something we're trying. We've done it 1 year and we've just renewed another year. We've, as a community, the the city, and the hospital has each kicked in money to fund a position for a technology outreach director for our community. So we're a small community, but knowing we've got that second gap we have to start to address. And I don't even know what that looks like. I'm very supportive of it. I know there's a need, but I don't know what the answer is. We're sending her to conferences to try to figure out how to reach out to the community. She's really worked with our major municipalities to update their websites and do some education in the community. Now she's working with the chamber to develop a chamber website that gives every chamber member a free website that she'll help them to develop. I kind of feel like we're inventing the wheel. I'm guessing there's probably a better answer out there, but with our limited resources, that's what we've been able to come up with. And it's neat that our community, the municipalities, saw how that benefits the community enough to fund that position.
Dan?
I'd like to just, when we started Network Nebraska, it was an unmanageable thing. It was a huge elephant, and we said, how do we eat this elephant one bite at a time? And we got people together in the same room who started addressing what our real issues were. And by collaboration, by aggregation, by putting together a network of people who may have worked somewhat together in the past. But the biggest thing that Gene and these people pointed us to was the policies prohibited us from doing that. And who are policies? Us. And so we're the digital divide. The people sitting in this room who haven't communicated the need to our people. There's a way. And when Senator Rake sat in the first meeting and he said, I'm going to tell you this, you're asking for $20 million a year for forever, and there's no money. And we all looked at each other like, now what? Well, he was right. It was about reprioritizing how we were spending money. We're spending enough money in the state right now. We just haven't created a high enough need or a high enough priority. Look at the state aid that goes out to schools. When you see schools that get $20 million more a year, and we're saying, can't that money be reprioritized? Can that money be categorized to outstate Nebraska that would help with some of those costs that we're trying to absorb? And so we're the digital divide. We're the people who write the policies, because there's a way. If we get enough people in the same room, we're from Nebraska, we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
I think
Yep.
one real quick thing.
Sure.
State aid, I was pretty surprised to find out that the schools that don't get state aid are mostly rural schools. All these schools, all Lincoln probably get state aid. But because of the value of the land and the ranch land, the farm land, the value of the land disqualifies a lot of rural schools from getting state aid.
The ag land value increase polarized Nebraska education. It did. Because it replaced state dollars with local property tax dollars, which is hurting our ag community, and we know it. But we don't have another solution, because we have never sat down as a legislature to say who should help us pay for education and which tax entity should it be. Now, we're off track, but I'm saying the same thing. When we sit down and we look at what the issue is and how we approach it, that makes a whole lot more sense than a pile of spreadsheets where there are winners and losers. Because I'm going to tell you, when that happens, rural Nebraska will lose. There are 27 senators in urban areas. We can't win. And I think that the urban senators are fighting for their people.
Okay.
And
Oh, I'm
that's it.
sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you out. Yes.
Yeah, I'm Heather Morgan. I run a 17-county regional economic development project in Southeast Kansas. We've been dealing with broadband for 2 years. So to the guy over there who I couldn't see through the camera, make sure that you bring. One of the things we've learned is bringing both the price cap providers and the rural telephone companies to the room with the elected officials is really important, because there is a business case. What we found in Kansas is local government started trying to develop their own networks. It's a really bad idea, probably, if you can't maintain them going forward. And so through bringing everyone together at the same table, we've had significant investment from those telephone companies, from those rural folks, from some of the bigger companies who are now making upgrades.
Thank you. And that'll lead me to my concluding comments here. Make no mistake, there's been tremendous advance, okay? There's been tremendous advance in broadband availability. But it's like running a half marathon, right? You cover those 10 miles, and it's those last 3 that you feel you have paid for all your sins. And so it's important to remember that, because exactly what she was saying, it brings me to my final point. You know, the policy stream model, Public Policy 101, right, talks about problems, policies, and politics. When those 3 converge, then we have what's called, you know, a policy that'll then emerge, and it'll pop up to the radar of legislators and then move on and become a policy. But the thing is, problem, we think there is a problem. We may agree what the problem is, right? The policies, we have models that work. It's just a matter of matching those 2 with the third one, which is bringing everybody to the same room, which is politics. And so I want to applaud all of you for being here today, participating. It's the beginning, I hope, of finishing that 3-mile half marathon. So thank you.